Good morning, everybody. I can't tell you how happy I am to welcome you today to participate in the international webinar on Che Guevara, held this day of the 27th of November 2020, the time being 10:02 on my screen. This has been the fruition of the efforts of a great many people and the universal spirit, and in particularly the collaboration of two departments, the Department of International Relations, Goa University, and the Department of English, Carmel College, New Goa. I especially want to thank our Vice Chancellor for giving us the go-ahead to host this seminar, our Principal, Dr. Aldina Braganza, who's with us on the session, and my Head of Department, Associate Professor Roxana Singh. Since the program schedule has been shared with you, we are not going to go into the details of the proceedings. We expect you to have read it by now. And this specifically refers to the CVs of the plenary speakers, which you will agree are formidable. With 4 minutes behind time, I invite our principal, Aldina Braganza E. Gomes, to please say a few words to welcome the gathering.
Now?
Come in, Aldina.
Yes, can you hear me, Brian?
Yes, we can hear you, Aldina. Sounding
Fine?
good. Yes, little
Okay.
louder, perhaps.
All right, okay, I will try to. All right, a very buddy and a warm welcome. It is my pleasure to set the tone with to each one of you participating in the international webinar in association with the Department of International Relations, Goa University for Women. It is my pleasure and part of this initiative, the enthusiasm that has been flowing over the last few days in infectious, and I think we are all bubbling with excitement about this webinar. Both the departments for organizing this initiative, because an initiative such as this, a man larger than life, an intellect, a revolutionist, Che Guevara. It is my pleasure to be part of this, as I to welcome the keynote speaker for today as well, Ms. Claire, who is the assistant professor in the Department of International Relations, Goa University. She will be giving a man behind the myth. I also like to welcome the other speakers for today. Professor of Latin American Studies, Center for Spanish and Latin America, Islamia, New Delhi. Shobha Saxena, International Operator, Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Shreya Banerjee, Research Social Science at IIT Mandi, Himachal Pradesh. A warm welcome to you all. I will also like to welcome the participants India and Goa, who are both presenting papers as well as participating as participants on this seminar. A very warm welcome to each one of you to Carmel College. Just to give you a small brief of Carmel College is the only women's college in the entire state of Goa, which is managed by an able and dynamic group of nuns, the Apostolic Carmel Congregation. Our foundress, Mother Veronica, who started this education for the empowerment of women through education almost 150 years ago in India. And so we have with us a rich tradition of empowering women and to become global citizens through education. And this is our basic mission of Carmel Institute, to give women an education that will not only make them altruistic leaders, but integrate academic excellence through human values. Our motto being Satyameva Mukti Danam. Truth is a gift and giver of life. With this few words, I set the tone for today's webinar with sharing briefly what I personally look at the whole theme. For me, it's an extension of friendship. It is our participation on life and openness to other cultures, traditions that make our life much more richer and exciting. For me personally, South America is about rhythm, which I would like to incorporate, a beat, a flowingness, a sense of life. And I think Che Guevara is an epitome of all that and more. I'm sure that the participants and students from across the world will truly enjoy and have an enriching experience today. So I wish you all the very best, and again, a very warm welcome from all of us at Carmel College. Thank you, Brian. I hand over the mic to you. Brian?
Thank you very much, Aldina. That was a beautiful welcome address. I'm sure all of us are most delighted to be in the presence of such a distinguished gathering. And I love the piece about the Latin American beat. And this is really what keeps the momentum going. Our next speaker is Ms. Clara Astaloa, Assistant Professor, Department of International Relations, Goa University. I would like to mention a few points about how this seminar got off the ground. It was basically just an initial talk which we had planned for our department and our teachers, students, but then we decided to get more ambitious, and this is where we are today. If Clara is in the house, then if she's ready to speak, I invite her to take us through the paper, Ernesto Che Guevara, the man behind the myth. It was actually poetry that brought us together. Last year, around this time, Clara was releasing her book of poems at the Goa Arts and Literature Festival at ICG Dona Paula, and I had the pleasure of moderating the book release. The name of the book is Mandala, and it is a trilingual edition of her poems in Spanish, English, and Hindi. If Clara is in the house, we would like to invite her to start. Since there seems to be some issue in connecting, I would like to invite the second speaker, that is Sonia Gupta, who is joining us from Delhi, to continue the proceedings. Sonia will speak on the topic, Che Guevara as an organic intellectual, a view from the global south. Sonia, can we have you on stage?
Good morning, Brian. Good morning, everybody. I'm particularly grateful to the organizers, Brian Mendonça, and of course, the principal of Carmel College, Dr. Aldina Braganza. I'm also happy to be interacting with Shobhan virtually after a long time. I've known him as somebody who writes constantly on Latin American affairs. So it's indeed a pleasure to be with this panel. I had hoped that the first speaker would have covered a lot of ground on the details of Ernesto Che Guevara's life, given her family's association with Che Guevara's family. So I had not planned to give you details about his early life particularly, but many of you may be familiar with it. I would straightaway go with the topic of my presentation today, which is, as you can see, Ernesto Che Guevara as an organic intellectual, a view from the global south. And I chose this topic because I knew that most of us who are participating in this webinar would be students, young students from the Carmel College, from the Goa University, and in privileged spaces of construction of, where images are formed, the hegemonic images are formed, magazines, TV, newspapers, movies, particularly the Hollywood movies. Che Guevara, if he's not outrightly demonized, I mean, the internet source is the first thing that you open, naturally dominated as they are by, Western monopolies, news monopolies. They often, reduce Che Guevara to just this long-haired romantic hero, a utopian adventurer, a Robin Hood, Don Quixote, an idealist, basically. So unattainable, always beautiful, but well away from the quotidian and therefore unusable and quite inoperative in everyday life. I think recovering Che beyond this image, beyond the face on the posters and the teacups, is basically means knowing him as the organic intellectual that he was, because Che embodies. He's in fact an outstanding combination of action and ideas. And his political thought, which is deeply humanistic, universal, is of immense relevance, I think, to the aspirations of the people of the global south in particular. But for all those who believe that a better world is possible. But I must say that Che's intellectual legacy actually is still waiting to be discovered. In fact, many of his works are yet to be translated from Spanish. I'll come back to that later. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that two of his emblematic texts, which kind of represent his theoretical production, Socialism and Man in Cuba and Message to the Tricontinental, have recently been published in a new translation by a Delhi-based independent publishing house, the Lechtword, very recently in October 2020. And in fact, the edition, it's a network of 20 publishing houses from the Tricontinental, that is publishing houses, independent publishing houses based in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that have jointly brought out this ebook. And it has a brilliant introduction by Ejaz Ahmad. And I would like to start by quoting Ejaz's introduction when he says that a great difficulty in reading Che is that he lived and died in a moment of history radically different from ours. His was a time when roughly 1/3 of humanity lived in socialist countries. A worldwide systemic confrontation between capitalism and communism was a fact of daily life. The Cold War, 1950s between the US and the USSR. And but also wars of national liberation were raging in all the three continents of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And he says that as such, Che's writing had the feel of messages sent in a bottle from a revolutionary past that we intercept as they go on their way to a revolutionary future. I end the quote. I think it is a beautiful image. We can imagine that here we are looking at Che today from a past of the 60s. And therefore, what I'd really like to do today is, to kind of look at his historical times. He was an Argentinian by birth. And as you know, the world is mourning today the death of another famous Argentinian, Diego Maradona, who, in fact, idolized Che. Many of you may know that, on his shoulder, he had a tattoo, big tattoo of Che, but not just as a fashion, because Maradona was another active, participant again in the fight against the kind of imperial globalization that we are living today. So I, in fact, pay homage to his memory too, and my condolences uh, on his untimely death. So these two great Argentinians, who are famous world over. So it would be important to remember that Che was Argentinian because in fact, he's known more for his lifelong commitment to the national liberation processes of his times, but particularly to the Cuban revolutionary process. As you know, some of you may know through movies, etc., that he was an active part of the rebel army. Fidel Castro and his other colleagues who had gone on this Granma yacht to the Sierra Maestra to oust the US-backed dictator Batista in 1959. But once the popular victory was achieved, Che played a stellar role actually as an institution builder in developing a planning system which would take the Cuban society from the neo-colonial status that it had. Cuba was a casino. It was a backyard of United States. It was a casino and it was prostitution. That is what Cuba was. And in terms of economy, mainly sugar. So the society's transition from this neo-colony to a socialist system, Che was a chief architect because he was assigned two of the most delicate and urgent economic measures to be taken: industrialization and the transformation of the banking system. And he carried out the responsibilities of admirably well. He was a minister of industry, the first minister of industry of Cuba. He was the director of the Agrarian Reform Institute and the president of the National Bank of Cuba. Just giving you these details in order for you to place him really. So my presentation basically talks about the historical transcendence of Che's intellectual contribution. I'll dwell on his times and briefly talk about his theoretical work, that is Socialism and Man in Cuba, in which he emphasizes the role of the individual as a subject, as an agent of social change, who is capable of transformation, who is capable of bringing out transformation, but in the process also transform herself or himself. And he does this through the process of tracing the process of the Cuban Revolution. Now, again, I would emphasize that Che is not born from a bubble, nor does he come from a flying saucer and falls to the earth he was a thinking and acting subject. He was a product of an era. And if one doesn't know the context in which he wrote, if one doesn't know what the Cuban Revolution was, how the continental anti-imperialist movement emerged, the figure of Che appears isolated, and therefore one turns him into a hero, into an icon of, almost irrational worship. And for us, it's not that. I mean, so what we're going to do is take a historical approach and talk about those decades of political and cultural rebellions to which Che belonged. To briefly say, it was a decade when Algeria became independent after a bloody war, a cruel war in which the French army used systematic torture. You may have heard of the French right-wing leader Le Pen. He was one of the torturers of the army in Algeria. Several African countries were decolonized, and there were large factory strikes going on in Italy, for example. A great student effervescence throughout the decade. In 68, 67, Che was assassinated in Bolivia. And 68, of course, you know that it is associated with the French May 68, the US, Germany, Japan, Mexico, all of them saw the kind of effervescence and, revolutionary upheaval. On the cultural level, it was again a rebellious critical moment. I don't have time to go through everything, but in Latin America, the dependency theory, which basically questioned that, the theory that was being given of modernization was that if you follow capitalist system, bring capitalism in agriculture, advance in capitalism, you will catch up with the advanced West. So the dependency theory said that in fact the underdevelopment of Latin America was a product of capitalism, and therefore capitalism could not be a solution to it. It was also the decade of the liberation theology, particularly in Latin America, which advocated the church of the poor, that the salvation is not life after death, but in earth itself. So, I mean, I don't have time to go into this beautiful moment, but even in the US, the imperialist metropoly, it was a decade of ferment, of criticism, of social indiscipline. I mean, even hippiism, if you can take it as revolutionary in some way, but certainly it was a movement of questioning the consumer society and its standards of life. I mean, if you look at literature, the Beat generation, backpackers who wanted to travel around the world rather than, meekly work in a factory or in an office. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that it was a decade of huge, revolutionary upheaval in the way we were looking at the world. So Che actually was a voracious reader. So he was obviously part of this entire current. Even when he was very small, when he was 17 years old, I think he had already read a lot of Marxism, because he had started creating a philosophy of dictionary, and he had put all the terms and concepts that he had come across in the books that he was reading. Several of his works are well known, the Bolivian Diary, Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolutionary War, the Motorcycle Diaries. But I'm going to basically talk in the little time that is left on Che Guevara's 1965 essay, Socialism and Man in Cuba, which is actually considered a milestone in 20th century emancipatory social thought. I give a course on Latin American intellectual thought, and this is one of the key texts that I teach. So basically, in this text, he refutes the idea that socialism is characterized by the abolition of individual for the sake of the collective or for the sake of the state. And through a reflection on the revolutionary process in Cuba, he says that Che shows that how communism as a process transforms not only the class relations, not only the systems of production, but also human beings themselves. And he says that you don't have to be an advanced capitalist country. He argues that a decent, egalitarian, fundamentally good and gracious society can be built at relatively low levels of industrial production and material wealth. We've seen it in Cuba. And that it is possible to try to produce, give well-being, intellectual development of the people, and help recover those potentialities of human nature that capitalism distorts and destroys, and which are essential for the building of a socialist culture and humane society. So in fact, what he's saying is that capitalism distorts the human nature itself. It suppresses our sociality. It suppresses the spontaneous openness that human beings have to each other, which is intrinsic to our nature, and creates self-centered, acquisitive individuals who are indifferent to the well-being of others. And therefore, the world turns into a crowd of alienated individuals. So he calls for the creation of a new man and a new woman. And what would be this new man and new woman? It would be this unalienated individual who would be oriented toward this radical sociality. And this would be the central task of the socialist society. So I think, on the other hand, he also talked about international solidarities. I think, so this vision of Che actually one can see today in today's situation of the pandemic that despite the US sanctions, Cuba is one of the few countries that has done extremely well in containing COVID-19, given its excellent health infrastructure. And in fact, it has even helped, as a part of its internationalism, developed countries like Italy in fighting COVID-19. I don't know if you remember that a few months back when Italy was, fighting these deaths, caused by the pandemic, a big team of Cuban doctors actually landed up there. And so it's the Che's legacy in the construction of Cuban socialism that can easily be seen in this national and international moral commitment and the human being at the core, not profit, not capital. Much of Che's writing, unfortunately, is not available to readers and researchers. So in 1983, Cuba set up the Che Guevara Study Center to encourage research and dissemination of his work and thought to the new generations, to young people like many of the students who are attending this webinar. And this center kind of houses documentary, photographic, and bibliographical collections, as well as research which is being carried out on his theoretical writings. I think, Brian, you should mention this webinar, send them information about this webinar that you're organizing. So, so in July 2013, in a joint proposal submitted by Bolivia and Cuba, UNESCO included Che's writing in its Memory of the World Register. So created in 1997, this Memory of the World Register actually lists the documentary heritage of world significance and of outstanding universal value. The collection, Life and Works of Ernesto Che Guevara, from the original manuscripts of his adolescence and youth to the campaign diary in Bolivia, includes 1,007 documents, a total of 8,197 pages that cover the period from 1928, that is Che's birth, to 1967, and concerning his revolutionary work, essays, and newspapers, etc. So UNESCO is very selective in deciding what to keep as memory of humanity, and the acceptance of Che's work against dehumanizing capitalism and his revolutionary, rebellious, and socialist example is clearly an extraordinary achievement, especially since the capitalist ruling classes worldwide and the US in particular resisted this entry of Che's works into this world memory of registers. So I'll conclude there by saying that it is in universities like the Goa University, which has such a wonderful Latin American Studies Center, and in colleges like Carmel colleges, which with committed intellectuals like Dr. Brian Mendonça. I have known him for very many years, and I know that he's committed to young people, learning. And it's I think important, therefore, that we are participating in this international webinar because it is extremely important for us to look at the figure of Che Guevara as a person from global south. And the internet may actually, there'll be hundreds of, first 100 entries will be actually demonizing him, and as they demonize Fidel Castro, calling him a dictator, etc. But I think in the global south, in the tricontinental research, we have to make our own views of these great intellectuals from the global south and create a pluriversal episteme, not an episteme which is only Western. There's nothing, no harm, of course. Europe has given us a lot, but it will be truly universal only when we have these voices from the global south also represented in the concert of knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonia. That was a very, very thought-provoking plenary address. I like the way you brought in the concept of the episteme, and it is vital that for a more, let's say, universal understanding of humanity, we need to accept the conviction, I would like to use the word, of the global south. Thank you once again for that beautiful address. We now invite Ms. Clara Astraloa to deliver the keynote address. Clara?
Good morning.
Good morning, Clara. We can hear you. Yes.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you see me? No?
Yes, we can see you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry, I had a connection issue that now fortunately is solved. So, good morning to all distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. For me, it's a great honor to deliver this keynote speech at this unique international webinar on Che Guevara. co-hosted by the Department of International Relations, Goa University, and the Department of English, Carmel College for Women. So I would also like to thank the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Varun Sani, for his support, as well as Professor Aparajita Gangopajai, Head of the Department of International Relations, as well as Dr. Aldina Braganza Gomez, Officiating Principal at Carmel College for Women. I also would like to thank the three distinguished speakers that we will broaden and enrich our first session, Professor Sonia Gupta, who has just done it, and Mr. Sherman Saxena, as well as Mrs. Shriya Banerjee, and all the presenters that will contribute magnificently as speaker today. I would also like to recognize the great effort of colleagues who have worked very hard preparing this seminar, as well as conceptualizing its substance. So let me first start with an insight into Che Guevara's image as a man behind the myth. His name, as it was written in his first ID and passport, was Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, but he was known at different times throughout his life, Tatu, Fernando, or Ramon. He received an official Cuban passport when a decree declared him a Cuban citizen by birth in 1959, a tribute to his role in the Cuban Revolution, although he renounced it when he went off to fight in the Congo. And from then on, he possessed several false passports with assumed names such as or Adolfo Mena Gonzalez, a businessman from Uruguay, whose identity he used to enter Bolivia for what was to be his final campaign. But the world knows him as Che. As Argentine researcher Lucia Alvarez de Toledo recalls, the nickname was given to him by his comrades in arms in Mexico when they were training for the invasion of Cuba. He loved it. He said, "For me, Che represents the most essential, the most loved aspect of my own life. How could I not like it? The first and second names of a person are small things, personal, insignificant. In contrast, I like Che very much. I like it very much when people call me Che." So the word Che was widely used in Latin America to refer to Argentines. It is an allusion to an interjection with which we, Argentinians, pepper our conversation when we talk to another person. For example, we usually would say, "¿Qué haces, Che?" which means, how are you doing, Che? In fact, it's an interjection that always refers directly to the other whom we are talking to. Can be interpreted as you or brother. So it's interesting to highlight how this nickname evocates not only a feature of his own, but a feature that recalls his linkage and involvement with the others. The expression has now been definitely hit-hacked by Guevara, but it reminds us of a crucial aspect of his life. He was an Argentine. Che Guevara wanted to be a new man in a world which was still old. This is how the Catalan philosopher Francisco Fernández Güell defines him when he recalled in the late 50s and 60s. He achieved that in the only way that this can be achieved in a socially divided world, with a tragic awareness of the self-control, pessimism and optimism of the will, with a certain fatalistic stoicism. The love of travel, adventure, and revolution were his hallmarks. Existential restlessness always drove him to travel, but never, not even in his youth, was he a tourist. Disagreement or conflict with those closest to him drove him to flight, but he always ended up turning the flight into an adventure. And once he was involved in the adventure, he imposed order, discipline, and asceticism on himself. Many men and women admired him for this, for his decency, for his nobility, for his equal treatment, for his mettle, for his bravery, his determination, his spirit of sacrifice, for his informal gestures, for his iconoclastic vocation, even when he held power. In Latin America, at the end of the 1950s, many saw in Guevara a version contradictory and tragic, but morally acceptable of the true Christian religious spirit. Many close testimonies, including one of my family, confirms. In the Catholic schools, we would collect money to send Che and Fidel, says my aunt-in-law, who was very close to Che's environment, being the fiancé of Che's cousin, Guillermo Guevara Lynch. My uncle-in-law was also a friend of Guillermo Guevara Lynch at the El Salvador school, and they still meet these days, once in a while. Everything that surrounded Che was romantic, my mother recalls, referring to the vision of Che that she and many other young people had of Guevara at the end of the 1950s in Argentina. News were coming from Sierra Maestra. They were living in tents, hidden in the middle of the jungle. There was a picture that showed a huge crucifix behind them. They represented an ideal. We dreamed at that time of being in the guerrilla with them to overthrow Batista. The Cuban Revolution's success was highly celebrated in Argentina. It only became controversial when communist measures began to be implemented, when Fidel's government began to show its true face. The brother of my friends, recalls my mother again, Malena García San Martín, he was called Falito San Martín, went to Cuba to the revolution, like many other young Argentinians. Shortly after, he returned and was received at the port with praise. Che's brothers themselves, as well as many others, followed Che's footsteps, and many ended up in prison, like his own youngest brother, Juan Martín, who was sent to prison by the Argentine military dictatorship for 8 long years. Recalling further close remembrances of the Argentinian Che by those years, my mother-in-law used to spend long periods in Che's grandparents' house in the city of Mar del Plata, Argentina, from 1959 to 1967. Her family would rent the house of Mrs. Marcos del Ponte de Guevara Lynch, Che's grandmother, and spend the whole summer vacations there. Che's family belonged to an aristocratic family, but economically diminished. It was a typical Mar del Plata stone house with 2 floors, a full garden of hydrangeas, a door with low bars. From the door you could see the Stella Maris Church and 5 blocks away the sea, she recalls. But Mar del Plata was at that time, and even today, the most thriving coastal city, and especially in the eyes of young people, the most attractive for its entertainment and nightlife. But she would recall again, but Che at that time was not interested in leading the comfortable life that his cousins and friends from his social stratum led. And thus she recalls, from early on, he had his eyes set on something else. In fact, in his first journey diaries, which he wrote in 1952, he has mentioned that he had only stopped in the north of Mar del Plata at an uncle's house only to stock up supplies and continue their route further south. Even in Miramar, the next coastal city, he defines this choice by leaving behind his fiancée, Chichina Ferreira, and the social class world that she represented. Between July 2nd and 3rd in 1959, Ernesto writes to his mother, "Dear mother, the old dream of visiting all the countries returns to me today. Although the sense of the collective has grown a lot in me, as opposed to the personal, I am still the same loner who is looking for his way without any personal help. Only now I have a sense of my historical duty. I feel not only a powerful inner force, which I always felt, but also the ability to inject it into others. That and an absolute fatalistic sense of my mission takes away all fear. The awareness of his destiny and the awareness that that destiny exceeded the individual and the known limits of his world of use are imprinted on him through his first journey through South America. Between 2000 and 2005, when I was between 20 and 25 years old, I traveled to the places where Che had traveled when he was my age. I crossed the 7 lakes in the south of Argentina and went on several trips to Bolivia and Peru, only with my backpack. I crossed the Bolivian highlands, the high plains, the mines, the jungles, and the territories that Guevara described in his diaries. In Peru, I thoroughly crossed the ancient Inca Valley, which is even today populated by the indigenous communities that strive to sustain their indigenous traditions in the midst of a political, economic, and social reality that rarely favors them. The deep Latin America, which in many aspects was not so different from that seen by Che, continued at the beginning of the 21st century, making use of these political, social, and economical structures not too distant from those that Che identified and set out to transform. The indigenous idiosyncrasies of Latin America, especially from my point of view, as well as Che's, both coming from a great metropolis with European aspirations as Buenos Aires, also marked from that moment onwards my worldview of the continent and my identity as a Latin American. After those enriching experiences, when I returned back to Buenos Aires, I finished my grade in history. I left my job, my family house, and life in Argentina and moved to the Bolivian Amazon jungle. Along with my husband, I settled in a very small town in the region of Santa Cruz de la Sierra called San José de Chiquitos, in a house made of clay, adobe, and metal sheets, and lived there for 3 years working for a Bolivian NGO that implemented El Sistema, a Venezuelan system that brings education to children. I moved to the Bolivian Amazon jungle in 2007. Only 40 years earlier, in 1967, a few hundred kilometers from the town I was living in the Amazon jungle, Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was assassinated by the CIA and the Bolivian army in a small hamlet of Guarani indigenous population called La Higuera. La Higuera, 40 years later after Guevara's death, as many other similar towns in the Amazon jungle, has a main street that is an earthen road of not more than 500 meters. And along this road, dotted on one side and the other, there are small adobe houses. During the day, the open doors reveal that these are only one-room homes with an earthen floor whose backyards are the mere extension of the hills. During the drafts, dust permeates to the corners of each of the 30 houses that make up the rains. The whole hamlet becomes a quagmire. Located in the foothills of the Andes, where there is no public lighting and where electricity only arrived 5 years ago, the poverty of the area, even today, forces people to move from their communities to the big cities. Despite being 300 kilometers from Santa Cruz de la Sierra, which is considered to be one of the most popular tourist attractions in Bolivia, La Higuera is not, even today, easily accessible. To get to La Higuera, at least 8 hours of travel is required along winding roads in poor conditions. The landslides caused by the rains are common, and the last supply of gasoline or food can be only made in Pucara, a tiny town of 1,800 inhabitants some kilometers away. After that, La Higuera today has 40 inhabitants. It was during the indigenous President Evo Morales' government that the old two-room school where Che was assassinated, paradoxically, he was assassinated in a school, was replaced by a new two-room school where the 10 children in the hamlet attend class. The Morales government also built a basketball court and a health social center, which is now attended by Cuban doctors in La Higuera. In the middle of the simplicity of the town square, the dog wall museum and the statue of about 3 meters of Che Guevara stands tall, welcoming the tourist to the hamlet. The statue of Che races under the Amazon sun as a legend of a dream, a utopia which sought to change the destiny of a country, of an entire continent, and even today records the symbol of a man's struggle, which then and now history has paradoxically turned into a myth. Within the hundreds of studies that have been focused on Guevara's figure as a man and as a myth, the interpretation of his life throughout history has been and is still controversial. On one hand, as Professor Sonia Gupta states, recovering Che for a popular and revolutionary field beyond the image on the posters and t-shirts implies knowing him as the organic intellectual that he was and that his thought represents for the people of the global South. Thirdly, Mr. Sherman Saxena will deepen into these two implied perspectives, Che as a global pop icon versus the Latin American Che as a living political force. On the other hand, Mrs. Shriya Banerjee will immerse us into Che Guevara's visit to India in 1959 to encompass the scope of his influence and impact in international affairs. Along the different papers that will be presented today, we'll delve into the many facets, perspectives, and approaches that Guevara's studies foster. His path, admired by some and questioned by others, becomes a symbol that even today fills a void for references and for figures, which may lead to that deep and sometimes perhaps forgotten human will to build a more just and supportive world from everyone. So to sum up, I would like to recall the most important and essential understanding which I think impacted me the most everlasting mark about Che. And this is the way Che Guevara essentially lived. He never stopped asking himself questions. He never stopped questioning his life and questioning the world around him, either in agreement or disagreement with his political position. We may recognize that Che was also fully committed to his time. He had the bravery to step out to see the world around him. Secondly, to question that world and the structures that shaped it. And finally, set his life into action towards that goal. Resembling Che, we can sense that only by discovering an inner revolution, that hopeful reality, and hope that hopeful reality we seek for ourselves and for our societies may willingly one day come true. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I hope the seminar will be a great success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clara. That was a very gripping account of your lived experience in the regions which Che has actually visited and traveled, and particularly your account of spending time with children in Bolivia and in a place contiguous to where Che passed on. We now invite Sherman Saxena, international correspondent, scholar, and cultural curator, who's joining us from Brazil, where I'm told it's almost midnight. Sherman, thank you very much for taking this trouble to be with us. The stage is yours.
Good morning, Dr. Brian Mendonça. Good morning to all my fellow panelists, Dr. Sonia Gupta, Dr. Clara Astaloa, Shreya Banerjee, Bom dia from São Paulo in Brazil. It's past midnight. It's 2:30 in the morning actually, and I'm trying to keep my voice level a bit low because we have some restrictions in the building where we stay that you can't go above certain decibel level. Let me start by thanking the Carmel College, Goa University, Department of Latin American Studies. Hello, can you hear me? Is it okay? Can I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. For giving me this opportunity to talk about Che Guevara, and of course, Dr. Sonia Gupta and Dr. Clara have given a very good perspective, academic perspective on his importance as an intellectual, the role he played in Latin America. Being a journalist, I'll try to bring, I'd like to tell some stories, my observations. I've been in this part of the world for 8 years, covering Latin America for various Indian publications, writing about the political situation in this part of the world, the social problems, etc. So I'll talk more in terms of that kind of narrative. Since we're talking about Che Guevara, I think he's been an iconic figure for decades. But what really, if we can say, put him on the global map was the movie The Motorcycle Diaries. So I'm going to talk basically in 3 parts. In first part, I talk about the movie The Motorcycle Diaries. What is the significance of this movie? The role it played in creating the myth or mythology of Che Guevara, or in uniting Latin America. What is the significance of this film? In second part, Che Guevara turning into a pop icon, mostly in North America and Europe, and also some other parts of the world, and his role and significance in Latin America, how it has evolved over the years, over decades, in fact. So let me start by talking about the film, The Motorcycle Diaries. The film was a Latin America's gift to the world of cinema. It was an unprecedented film in the sense that it was a beautiful example of collaboration between a Brazilian director. The music was composed by an Argentinian composer.
Sorry for the break in the talk. I think Shobhan is experiencing some connectivity issues. So we can just wait for a minute or two. Otherwise, we request our 4th speaker, Shreya, to be on standby and be ready for the opportunity to speak at this platform. Meanwhile, I take the opportunity to welcome Professor Aparajita Gangopadhyay, Head of Department of International Relations, Goa University. Welcome, ma'am. It is because of your dynamism that this is happening. And I think the synergy between Carmel College and Goa University has really been outstanding. Thank you very much to you and your team. Without you, this would not have been possible. We look forward to your collaboration in the parallel sessions as well. I don't think Shobhan has joined yet. Can I invite the 4th speaker, Shreya, to please deliver the plenary address. Shreya Banerjee.
Yeah, thank you so much. Am I audible?
You're very, very audible and clear. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. A very good morning to all. And I would like to thank the organizers, first of all, Department of International Relations, Goa University, and Carmel College for Women. Thank you. Special thanks to Clara for inviting me to deliver the talk. And I'll just take a second because I have a presentation to show. So I'll just try to do this. Is my presentation visible to everyone?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. My topic today is Che Guevara's visit to India in 1959, internationalization of domestic needs. And
You can change your screen to slideshow, please.
yeah.
Slideshow, it will be nicer. Yeah, thank you. That's it.
Okay. Yeah. So the presentation would cover the following topics. So I would be mentioning about his visit in India, Che and Nehru, the ideals of the charismatic leaders, the convergences and divergences based on the ideologies, Cuba and India towards an international solution to domestic needs, and then I'll conclude it. So before starting the presentation, here I would like to quote Che himself. When he visited India, he said the following thing. So, before beginning this, I would like to share his views. So he said, we have the same political and economic system, a similar past of opprobrium and colonization, the same direction in our line of progress, yet the solutions very similar and geared towards the same objective, differ like day from night. He also said that while Nehru received us with an amiable familiarity of a patriarchal grandfather, but with noble interest in the dedication and struggles of the Cuban people, giving us extraordinarily valuable suggestions and assurances of unconditional sympathy towards our cause. So the visit of Che Guevara ought to be recorded as a historically significant tour of Asia. The complementary motivations of his visit were economic and political in nature. To build a strong bloc of countries that will steer away from Cold War era bipolar politics, also to build a consensus among NAM countries. And this was not only limited to the Cold War politics, but also to build favorable relations with countries so as to address Cuba's growing domestic needs. As Professor Gupta has rightly mentioned, that he was heading the few institutions back there in Cuba. So here his visit was overall related to economic and political motivations. So in this paper, I've tried to analyze the importance of Che's visit in terms of the state reception, that how he has been received in India. It also examines the ideological basis of both the charismatic leaders, that is Che and Nehru, that provided a structure to the foreign policies of their countries. It also indicates the convergences and divergences in India and Cuba's policies and outlook during the 1950s and 60s. So basically, all in all, this paper is trying to fill the gap of a non-existing academic debate surrounding Che's visit, as this has been largely ignored for a long period of time. So when he came to India, he was leading a 6-member delegation, out of which 2 were economists. So he expressed a strong desire for strengthening trade and economic relations between the two countries. So his visit to India was not very well documented in the press, as while doing this research, I've visited few libraries and archives where I could find only in the leading dailies and in very, very brief headlines about his visit. So it was not very well documented. And also he has visited many sites highlighting rapid industrialization and infrastructural development. He was upset by the fact that there exists a wide gap between the rich and the poor. Also, the ideals of the charismatic leaders, both Che and Nehru, so the major ideas of Che's ideology were humanism and internationalism. Also, Nehru had similar ideals of socialism, internationalism, and nationalism. So their views were at many points at par with each other. When he came to India, Nehru presented him a kukri, which is the as a gift, which was the symbol of understanding and showing recognition to the prevalent ideologies and ways of achieving independence. So the convergences and divergences based on the ideologies can be documented as the Cuban foreign policy is anti-hegemonic in character, and the political culture of Cuban foreign policy basically international assertiveness and moral impetus, which was strikingly progressive. Also, the Nehruvian foreign policy during that period was also of internationalist in nature, and the central element of his policy was to maintain ethical modernity. So the foreign policies of both the countries had same vision and approach, which brings them closer to each other. Towards an international solution to domestic needs, if we say, so the challenge for the Cuban regime was the grave economic situation prevailing in the country. To overcome that, Cuba wanted to establish and improve the existing trade relation. Sugar was the basis of the Cuban economy. They wanted to export more of it and create resources for the funding of expensive projects to move away from US hegemony. So the two countries were exploring ways and means of developing trade with each other. The major development, political development rather, I would say, which happened after his visit, that the Cubans already had a consulate in Calcutta, but there was no Indian diplomatic mission engaged in Cuba. So thereafter, an Indian embassy was established in Cuba in 1960. And his visit was based basically on domestic needs, as it was a critical moment in Cuban history causing economic hardships. Not only this, the manifestation of the policy of non-alignment started a united movement looking upon the conditions of peace in the world as sine qua non for freedom and progress. And I would also like to add here, uh, yeah, so that after doing this paper, I got more interested and I did one more research regarding, the relevance of Che's ideas and thoughts and his iconography. So I did a research in a central university based in Delhi, where I interviewed the student activists, how they are perceiving Che and his thoughts and how relevant are those thoughts and idea in their present day student activism. So I have interviewed around 25 to 13 student activists in the university, and what I found after my research and field observations is that Che has been Che has been forgotten in the mainstream left political parties, as also his visit to India is never discussed. It is, mostly been overlooked. So even the communist parties also have no much documentation, but they have a structural logic to forget him as well. So a concreted effort was made to brush his memory so that he can only be used as a brand in the market of consumer goods. And also the recent development in that university, so there are many ways people are remembering him. So there was an establishment of a new dhaba which is named as a gorilla dhaba, and this became a lot of like, because a lot of people wants to remember him in their own ways, and this was one of the ways they found out. So yeah, in the end I would say that Che will be more relevant in the future times to come. He is relevant for his revolutionary idols, as he has everything is revolutionary in his life form, basically from his photography to the way he lived, the way he spoke, the way he wrote. So the holistic approach of Che has to be located in the revolutionary tradition. Unless and until that has been done, he'll be most of the times would be misinterpreted or misunderstood. So yeah, this is all, and I would also like to briefly mention about my research area. What I'm presently researching on is about the Indo-Mexican relations. So I'm trying to join the dots and the connecting links between India and Mexico as well. So I've started my research doing this paper, and also I would like to share that I'm very overwhelmed to see such a keen interest of the students in for a topic like this, because I myself have studied in a women's college, and I can understand the enthusiasm you all must be having here. So yeah, let's hope we will be having a great day ahead. And thank you so much again to the organizers and to everybody. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Shreya. Thank you for speaking and highlighting things which have occurred in our own backyard. We find at many times that when it comes to Che, there is a deliberate move to obscure certain activities. And I'm so happy that this webinar is moving towards a deeper realization of this, I don't know, conspiracy. It's very important that you appreciated the efforts of students, because seriously speaking, I would not have done it if I hadn't to teach my third-year travel writing students. They are all here, and it's nothing like a morning with your students' faces smiling at you. So many of us here are teachers. I am waiting for Shobhan to join, because we are down to 7 minutes more. And we'd like to take some questions if there are any in the house. Anybody would like to make a comment or make an observation? Rico, Naveen, Nandkumar, Sonia, Clara.
Brian?
Yes,
Brian?
yes, Sonia, come in.
Brian, I completely forgot that this is also a part of your travel writing course. So I would just like to, I mean, I'm sure Shobhan would have spoken about Motorcycle Diaries, but I'd just like to quote from, this book, Motorcycle Diaries, Notes on a Latin American Journey. So I just want to say that these journeys, this grand tour which Che did as a young medical student in the 1950s were actually journeys of his political awakening. And so I'm just going to quote shortly from the preface to this book, which has been written by Che's daughter, Aleida Guevara, who was here recently last year, and I had the privilege of translating her from Spanish to Hindi during her rallies and talks. So I'm just going to quote, and that's my comment. She says that my father shows us a Latin America that few of us knew about. His awareness grows that what poor people need is not so much his scientific knowledge as a physician, he was a doctor, but rather his strength and persistence in trying to bring about the social change that would enable them to live with the dignity that had been taken away from them and trampled upon for centuries. So I think from the context of travel writing and travel literature, it's very interesting. This preface of Aleida Guevara is interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you for bringing up the question of the syllabus. And for that, we need to really thank the Goa University and its vision in putting out for us the CBCS pattern where students, can choose what they want to study. I mean, this is the first time we are doing film and, traveling across Latin America. I'm wondering whether I'm actually teaching or enjoying having the time of my life. So Rico has put a note here in the chat box. She says, we are so careless at documenting things and don't believe in keeping track of our own histories, events, and trends. That is such a valuable comment, Rico. We need to document our lived experience. Would anyone like to comment on that? Naveen, perhaps? Okay. So we are kind of nudging towards the end of the session. If anybody would like to say anything, now's the time to do it. Students, this is your chance to say something to this distinguished audience. My third-year students are very much here. Hopefully they haven't left. So this is always happening in an online class, but we did hit 60 on this meet, and I'm so delighted that it has reached this number. There are people waiting to get in also, but it's the end of the line at the moment. So students, special call for any of you who would like to say something.
Ma'am?
Yeah, come in, Sapna.
So you know well that even I'm doing a paper on Che Guevara and Cuba. So I was like, it's really confusing political time. Like it's a Cold War thing going on, a capitalist USSR. So now we see how communism is. Okay, so was it a right decision made by Che? I'm really confused about this because now you well said that Western people portray him differently. Even in my paper, I felt it is different because communism now is a very controversial thing to discuss. We see China, North Korea, how in the state they are. So was it a right decision made by Che at that time?
Thank you, Sapna. I think Sonia would like to answer, perhaps. So, Sonia, can you help us with that answer?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is an internal question, which system is better, whether it's capitalism or whether it's socialism. I think people from each region will decide. We have seen the flaws of the electoral democracy in one of the oldest democracies in the world, which has just held elections. So no system, of course, is foolproof. I mean, it was amazing to see the kind of tussle which is still going on between the two presidents and, the president-elect and the previous president in the US. And we are seeing how the pandemic particularly has exposed. So even in a country like New Zealand, which is not a socialist country, you see it has been able to control the pandemic because it has been able to build a health infrastructure for its people. So what is it that you want to give? Whether it's socialism, capitalism, don't give it a name. What we want is basic life of dignity ensured for everybody. Having said that, what I would like to say is, since I'm a student of Latin American studies, in Latin America, from the 1990s onward, there is a literal class war going on. You have seen what happened in Bolivia, recent elections in Bolivia, where for the first time an indigenous president was elected, President Evo Morales, and last year he was brought down. There was literally a coup. This year's election, again, the indigenous backed movement towards socialism has won elections in a major way. So at least in Latin America, the idea of a state which will be able to provide a life of dignity, education, health is actually an idea that inspires millions across the continent. And therefore, I think even the kind of socialism that will be built, Che, by the way, was very critical of the Soviet model. He said that Cuba should not repeat the kind of mistakes that Soviet Union had made. And as I study only literature, he actually, in Socialism and Man, talks against imposition of any kind of model or code, or for that matter, socialist realism. So I think any new society, if it calls itself socialist, will have to be really democratic in its content. And as far as North Korea is concerned, again, there is a hybrid war against some of these countries. I'm not too sure I know what's happening in North Korea, because I certainly cannot go by the huge Western propaganda machine, which demonizes many countries. I mean, I will therefore speak about Vietnam, with huge achievements as a socialist country. So I think the jury is still open on whether one system is better than the other. And I think it's the people of that country which will decide. We don't want interferences from anywhere, the kind we are seeing in Venezuela. US has put sanctions against Venezuela, in Iran, etc. So I think it is too early to write out the obituary of any of the systems. Che, that's why I said, fervently believed in certain ideals And though people will say, Bekar mein mar gaya, bichara, and you don't know why did he die for those ideals, there are people who are ready to die for certain ideals. Yeah. But he said that you may kill me, but my ideas will not be killed. So I think ideas survive.
Yes,
So thank
ma'am.
you, Sonia. Thank you very much for that very insightful answer. I want to share with you my experience in putting a part of this webinar together. If you visit a couple of the bookshops here in Goa, you don't get anything on Latin America, period. How are these ideas, you see, going to percolate to students first? Okay, we know about them to a certain extent, but there is an absolute embargo, on Latin American literature anyway. You won't even get a picture book for a student. Perhaps in Central Library, I did see a beautifully illustrated book of Indian myths. That's, Latin American myths of creation. But that is such an esoteric place to go. It should be available for purchase. We are happy to welcome once again Sherman Saxena, and without any further ado, we invite him to continue with his plenary address. Sherman, the stage is yours. I think 2 minutes into your speech,
Brian,
yeah, 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, you can take it from there. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
all right.
We lost most of it, I would say. Yeah.
Just give me a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the last thing he spoke?
So
Shobhan?
Basically,
Shobhan, listen.
Yeah.
You spoke, we lost you at the point where you said, I'm going to talk about 3 things. My first part is Motorcycle Diaries. Huh? We lost you there. So can you take it from there, please?
Right. Okay, fine. All right. Okay. So basically, diaries, which played a very, very important role in recreating the myth, if you want to call it, of Che Guevara. The second part, how he became a pop icon in some parts of the world, especially in North America and Western Europe. And third part, how he continues to remain a living idea, a thought in Latin America, basically. So because this connection is not very stable, so let me do it quickly so that we're not lost again. The most interesting thing about the movie The Motorcycle Diaries was it was completely a Latin American film. An unprecedented example of collaboration between a Brazilian director, Argentinian music composer, Puerto Rican screenwriter, and actors who came from all across the region from Mexico to Argentina.
We lost Shobhan once more. I hope he's joining again. We are running out of playing time. So any questions to be taken, maybe? Yeah. Okay, Vedangi, would you like to ask something? Okay, Naveen, why don't you say something? Naveen, unmute your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Naveen, come in.
Well, Motorcycle Diaries may have been an unprecedented Latin American collaboration aesthetically, but finances came from America. It was a Hollywood film.
You lost to again. Yeah.
Finances came from basically the Sundance Institute, and the allied ancillaries. Specifically, Mr. Robert Redford was a backer of this film.
Right. Thank you, Naveen. Shobhan is back. You can continue, Shobhan. Shobhan, please unmute your mic. Please continue.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, Shobhan, we can hear you.
Okay, fine. So just let me talk about the film, The Motorcycle Diaries. At the end of the movie, when Che Guevara and his friend, they are saying goodbye to their friends in Peru, the last country they were in, and he says, even though we are too insignificant to be spokesmen for such a noble cause, we believe, and this journey has only confirmed this belief, that the division of America into unstable and illusory nations is a complete fiction. We are one single mestizo race from Mexico to the Magellan Straits, and so in an attempt to free ourselves from narrow-minded provincialism, I propose a toast to Peru and to a united America. This is the message from the film, because he's talking about a shared history, a shared culture, a people from Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina, a same history of colonization, of slavery, exploitation, denial of rights. Very, very important quote. And if you look at some of the interviews with the director of the film, Walter Solis, he talks repeatedly about how the unit of the film, the director, the writer, the music composer, and the actors, they themselves discovered their own history of Latin America in the making of the film. This is very, very important discovery. And he talks about, in an interview, he was asked if he'll move to Hollywood, because this is what happens in mostly emerging countries or developing countries. When you become successful at home, your next step is Hollywood. But he
I think it's a long distance, you see, from Sao Paulo to Goa. And it seems to be showing in the connectivity. Coming back to Naveen's question, he did point out that the funding for Motorcycle Diaries was by the Sundancers in the US. So how does one look at the, you know, the intermeshing of capitalism and, if you like, communism? Anyone would like to take it up? Anybody? Yes, Sonia?
No, I quite agree with the observation made that, in fact, that is very much happening with the Cuban film industry also, because of the resource crunch, and happening with many, many cinema houses. Argentine cinema, independent cinema is very strong, but many of these, directors have to depend on European finance, and it certainly has an impact on way the final cinematic text is shaped.
Hello.
Come in, Naveen, come in.
I agree with Professor Gupta 100%, because you see, indie filmmaking, which is independent filmmaking, is a very risky proposition, and you have to have like-minded people on board to produce it. Robert Redford, for all his good looks and his killer boy image and his, wonderful exploitative cinema, as people would call it, is a very astute, person. Him and Paul Newman were in fact responsible for ushering a lot of independent cinema in America. So Robert Redford and his board of executives got on board and asked Mr. Walter Sias, who in fact, ironically, happens to be the son of a billionaire. His father has founded the Brazilian banking industry. He is worth $1.8 billion right now, one of the richest directors in the world, even perhaps to the tune of Mr. Whichever guy you want to say in Hollywood. So he got on board And a lot of this film was tailor-made for Western audiences, you know, not for Latin American audiences. It was made mushy and chocolatey and very, you know, Hollywoodish. Professor Gupta will probably agree with me. So, but the entire world, this is the charm of Che Guevara. The entire world is enamored of him. Even the you know, Americans and the Western Europeans who may deride him, but there was something in the man, and that was, as Professor Gupta said earlier, he died for what he believed in. There are no more people who die for what they believe in this or last century.
Thank you, Naveen. I am sure that we will have more to listen to you in session 1. That brings us to the end of the plenary. We are most happy to register and acknowledge the presence of each and every one of you. And if I may say so, Sonia and Naveen both are very good friends of mine. Why don't you people decide it, you know, over a cup of chai, because you guys are both in Delhi, right? IGNCA and Jamia Millia. I visited these two places, you know, enjoying your hospitality. So
well, thank you for introducing Professor Gupta to me. I'm sure she's going to be a friend in future now.
Yes, of course. I look forward to more interaction with you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
This is the reason why these platforms are created. We are already in the 120-second barrier now. That's when our next session is going to start. We have sort of kicked the joining time to the winds. So I'm just going to very briefly make a few announcements and call this session to a close. We have 6 plenary sessions lined up immediately after this. The first one, chaired by Ma'am Roxana Singh, is Che Guevara Today. The papers are Rearranging Furniture, Legacy of Che Guevara. The second, Text to Film. The third, Motorcycle Diaries as Medical Anthropology. The fourth, Che Guevara, The Man and the Myth. And the fifth, Hospitality in South America. Session 2 is chaired by Glenys Mendonça. It features 5 papers. Counterculture. Of course, counterculture is the theme for the second session. And it features a paper on Che Guevara and Kerala. It features a paper on Che and Communism, Counterculture and Che Guevara's Evolving Legacy, A Journey That Led to a Revolution, and Che Guevara, A Hero for the Youth. Moving on to the third session. This is chaired by Yugank Naik, Assistant Professor, Department of International Relations, Goa University. The theme is Che Guevara and Identity. It includes papers on the subjects of machismo in Latin American society, the legacy of a true revolutionary, motorized bums, shifting identities in Motorcycle Diaries, Che Guevara from revolutionary Cuban to global phenomenon, and the leadership of Che Guevara. In session 4, chaired by Jolene D'Souza, we have topics devoted to Che Guevara and the youth. We have papers like Che Guevara, Model for the Youth, Influences on Che's Life, Che Guevara's Road to Power, Che Guevara and Cuba, and Che Guevara's Path to Enlightenment. Just 2 more parallel sessions to announce. The first chaired by Aisha Antao, and containing papers like Che, Goa, and the Forgotten World of Radical Politics, Che's Cuban Hero, Understanding Dissent, and Che Guevara's Journey Across Latin America. Final plenary session is by Clara Astorloa, the chairperson, containing papers Che Guevara and the Literary Context, Letters as History, Argentine's Autobiography on La Poderosa, Che as Visionary, and Discovering the Cause of Che Guevara's Pursuit in Latin America through the Notes. So that was a brief run through of what is happening in the parallel sessions. You are invited now to leave this session and to join the session of your choice by clicking the Google Meet link provided. Thank you very much. Stay in touch. Have a wonderful day, and all the best to all of you. You can continue with your comments and observations on the Che Guevara email dedicated address, Che Guevara webinar at gmail.com. Thank you. And once again, adios.